Margaret Smith stood outside the grand concert hall, her hands shaking as she held the small piece of paper with her audition number. The building was huge and fancy, with tall white columns and golden doors that seemed to shine in the afternoon sun. She had never been inside such a beautiful place before. She looked down at her simple blue dress. It was her best dress, but it looked old and plain compared to what everyone else was wearing. The other people waiting in line had expensive clothes and perfect hair. They carried fancy music bags and talked about famous teachers and music schools. Margaret was 45 years old and worked as a cleaner at the local school. She had learned to play piano by herself, using old books she found at the library. For 20 years, she had practiced on an old piano in her small apartment. Her neighbors sometimes complained about the noise, but she never stopped playing. Music was the only thing that made her happy. The audition was for the city's music competition. The winner would get to play with the famous orchestra and receive $10,000. Margaret had saved money for months just to pay the entry fee. She knew she probably had no chance, but she had to try. As she waited in line, she heard people talking about her. A young woman with long blonde hair and a sparkly dress laughed loudly. "Look at that woman over there," she said to her friends. "What is she doing here? This is for real musicians, not people who play piano as a hobby." A man in an expensive suit looked at Margaret and shook his head. "She must be lost," he said. "Maybe she thinks this is some kind of community center event. Someone should tell her this is serious music." Margaret felt her face turn red, but she did not move from the line. She had come too far to give up now. She thought about her late mother, who had always told her that music comes from the heart, not from fancy clothes or expensive schools. More people started to notice her. They whispered and pointed, some even taking pictures with their phones. Margaret heard words like embarrassing and what a joke. One woman said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "They really let anyone audition these days. This is supposed to be for professional musicians." The line moved slowly forward. Margaret watched as other musicians went in and came out. Some looked happy, others looked sad. Each person who went before her made her more nervous. Her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. Finally, it was her turn. A tall woman with glasses called her number. "Number 47, she said in a bored voice. Margaret walked toward the door, feeling like everyone was watching her. She heard someone behind her say, "This should be interesting," followed by more laughter. The audition room was even more beautiful than the outside of the building. The ceiling was very high, with paintings of angels and clouds. Crystal lights hung down like frozen raindrops. In the center of the room sat a huge black piano that looked like it cost more than Margaret's apartment. 5 judges sat at a long table in front of the piano. They wore serious expressions and expensive clothes. When they saw Margaret walk in, she noticed their faces change. One judge looked surprised. Another looked annoyed. The woman in the middle, who seemed to be the head judge, looked like she had tasted something bad. "Name?" the head judge asked without looking up from her papers. "Margaret Smith," she answered in a quiet voice. "And where did you study music?" Another judge asked. Margaret felt her face get hot again. "I taught myself," she said. The judges looked at each other. One of them made a note on his paper. Another judge sighed loudly. The head judge finally looked up at Margaret with cold eyes. "Mrs. Smith," she said, "this audition is for trained musicians. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Margaret's hands were shaking, but she remembered her mother's words again. "Yes, ma'am, I would like to play for you." The head judge looked at her watch. "Very well, you have 5 minutes. What will you be playing?" Margaret walked to the piano. Her legs felt weak, but she kept moving. "I will play Chopin's Ballade No. 1, she said. One of the judges laughed out loud. "Chopin? That's one of the most difficult pieces ever written. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something simpler?" Margaret sat down on the piano bench. It was much nicer than the old chair she used at home. She looked at the keys, which were so white and clean they seemed to glow. She could feel the judges watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She placed her fingers on the keys and took a deep breath. For a moment, she forgot about the judges, the fancy room, and all the people who had laughed at her. She thought about her mother, who had died 5 years ago without ever hearing Margaret play a real piano. Margaret began to play. The first notes came out soft and gentle, like a whisper in the big room. Her fingers moved across the keys like they had a mind of their own. She had played this piece hundreds of times in her small apartment, but it had never sounded like this. The sound that came from the grand piano was rich and full. Every note seemed to fill the entire room, bouncing off the high ceiling and painted walls. Margaret felt like she was flying. Her fingers danced across the keys, playing the difficult runs and jumps that had taken her years to learn. As the music got louder and more dramatic, Margaret forgot everything else. She forgot about her old dress, her simple life, and all the mean things people had said. She was no longer Margaret the cleaner. She was Margaret the musician, and this was her moment. The judges had stopped writing on their papers. They sat perfectly still, watching Margaret's hands move across the keys. The annoyed expressions on their faces had changed to something else. One judge's mouth was open. Another was leaning forward in his chair. Outside the audition room, people had stopped talking. The musicians waiting in line could hear the music through the thick doors. Some of them moved closer to listen better. The blonde woman who had laughed at Margaret earlier was now standing with her ear pressed against the door. Margaret played the middle section of the piece, which was soft and sad. Her fingers touched the keys so gently that the notes seemed to float in the air. Some of the judges felt tears starting in their eyes, though they tried to hide it. Then came the final section, where the music became wild and powerful. Margaret's hands flew across the keyboard, playing notes so fast they sounded like rain on a roof. The music grew louder and stronger, building to the final dramatic ending. When the last note rang out, the room became completely silent. The silence in the audition room lasted for what felt like forever. Margaret sat at the piano bench with her hands still resting on the keys. She could hear her own heartbeat and the sound of her breathing. The judges stared at her with wide eyes, as if they had just seen something impossible. The head judge was the first to speak. Her voice was much softer than before. "Mrs. Smith," she said, "that was extraordinary." She looked down at her papers, then back at Margaret. "Where did you say you learned to play?" Margaret stood up from the piano bench slowly. Her legs still felt weak, but now it was for a different reason. "I taught myself, ma'am. I have been playing for 20 years. One of the male judges leaned forward. 20 years? You mean you have been playing like this for 20 years and no one has heard you?" "I play at home," Margaret said. "Sometimes at my church for Sunday service, but mostly just for myself." The judges looked at each other again, but this time their expressions were completely different. Instead of doubt and annoyance, their faces showed amazement and respect. "Mrs. Smith," said another judge, "that was one of the most beautiful performances of Chopin I have ever heard. And I have been judging music competitions for 30 years. Margaret felt tears starting in her eyes. No one had ever said anything like that about her playing before. Most people in her life did not even know she could play piano at all. The head judge stood up. "We need to discuss this," she said to the other judges. "Mrs. Smith, please wait outside for a few minutes." Margaret walked toward the door on shaky legs. When she opened it, she saw that a crowd of people had gathered in the hallway. All the musicians who had been waiting for their turns were standing there, along with some of the people who had already auditioned. As soon as they saw her, the crowd began to clap. The blonde woman who had laughed at her earlier was clapping the loudest. Her face was red and she looked embarrassed. "It was incredible," said a young man with a violin case. "I have never heard anything like that. Where do you perform?" Margaret did not know what to say. "I do not perform anywhere," she said quietly. The people in the crowd looked shocked. "You do not perform?" asked an older woman. "But you play like a professional, better than most professionals." More people gathered around Margaret, asking her questions. Where did she study? Who was her teacher? What competitions had she won? Each time she answered that she had no formal training, no teacher, and had never competed before. They looked more surprised. A reporter who had been covering the auditions pushed through the crowd with a camera. "Ma'am, can I ask you a few questions?" "That performance was amazing. Our viewers would love to hear your story." Margaret felt overwhelmed. She had never had so many people paying attention to her before. All her life, she had been invisible. People looked through her when she cleaned. Their offices and schools? No one ever asked her opinion about anything. Now suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to her. Before she could answer the reporter, the audition room door opened again. The head judge came out with a serious expression. The crowd became quiet. "Mrs. Smith," the judge said, "could you please come back in?" Margaret walked back into the beautiful room. The 5 judges were all standing now, which had not happened for any of the other auditioners. They looked at her with new eyes, as if they were seeing her for the first time. "Mrs. Smith," the head judge began, "we have been judging music competitions for many years. We have heard thousands of musicians, including many who have studied at the best music schools in the world. What we just heard was truly exceptional." Margaret felt her heart beating fast again. She did not know if this was good news or bad news. Another judge stepped forward. "Your technical skill is remarkable, but more than that, you have something that cannot be taught. You have a gift for making the music come alive. You played with such emotion and passion that we all felt it in our hearts. However," the head judge continued, "we have some concerns. This competition is for professional musicians. The winner will need to perform with our city orchestra in front of thousands of people. They will need to work with a conductor and other musicians. They will need to handle the pressure of professional performance." Margaret felt her heart sink. She had known this was too good to be true. They were going to tell her that her playing was nice, but she was not the right kind of person for their competition. "We have a question for you," the head judge said. "If you were to advance in this competition, would you be willing to work with a music coach? Someone who could help you prepare for performing with the orchestra?" Margaret's eyes widened. "You mean I passed the audition?" "Mrs. Smith," said the youngest judge with a smile, "you did not just pass. You gave us the best audition we have heard in years. We want to see what you can do with proper support and preparation." Margaret felt dizzy. She grabbed the edge of the piano to steady herself. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I would be willing to work with a coach." The judges smiled at each other. "Then congratulations," the head judge said. "You are moving on to the next round of the competition." Margaret started to cry. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, but she had never really believed it could happen. She thought about her mother, who had always believed in her music, even when no one else did. "There is one more thing," the head judge said. "The local newspaper wants to write a story about you, and there is a television station that wants to interview you. Are you comfortable with that?" Margaret wiped her eyes. "I do not understand why anyone would want to write about me." "Mrs. Smith," the judge said gently, "you are an inspiration. You show that talent and dedication matter more than money or fancy schools. Your story will give hope to many people who have dreams but think they cannot achieve them." When Margaret left the audition room for the second time, the crowd in the hallway was even bigger. News had spread quickly about the unknown woman who had amazed the judges. People were taking pictures and videos with their phones. The blonde woman who had mocked her earlier pushed through the crowd. Her face was red with shame. "Ma'am," she said to Margaret, "I owe you an apology. What I said earlier was wrong and mean. You are a real musician, and I hope you can forgive me." Margaret looked at the young woman's face and saw genuine regret. "It is okay," she said. "We all make mistakes." "No," the woman said, "it is not okay. I judged you by your appearance instead of giving you a chance. That was wrong. You have more talent in your little finger than I have in my whole body." Other people in the crowd began to apologize too. The man in the expensive suit looked embarrassed. As he said, "I was completely wrong about you. I hope you can forgive an old fool." Margaret felt strange hearing all these apologies. She was not angry at these people. She understood why they had judged her. She looked different from them, and people often fear what they do not understand. As she walked toward the exit of the concert hall, Margaret felt like she was in a dream. Her whole life had changed in the space of one afternoon. Tomorrow she would still have to go to work cleaning offices, but now she had something else to look forward to. The reporter caught up with her at the door. "Mrs. Smith, can you tell us how you feel right now?" Margaret thought for a moment. "I feel grateful," she said. "Grateful for the gift of music and grateful for the chance to share it with others. What would you say to other people who have dreams but think they are too old or it is too late?" Margaret smiled. "I would say it is never too late to try. If you have something inside you that wants to come out, you should let it. The world needs to hear what you have to offer." The next morning, Margaret woke up in her small apartment and wondered if everything had been a dream. She looked at the piece of paper on her nightstand that said she had passed the first round of the competition. It was real. It had all really happened. She got ready for work as usual, putting on her cleaning uniform and packing her lunch. But when she arrived at the school where she worked, everything was different. The principal, Mrs. Henderson, was waiting for her at the front door with a big smile. "Margaret," Mrs. Henderson called out, "I saw the news about you on television this morning. I had no idea you could play piano like that. Why did you never tell us?" Margaret felt embarrassed. "I did not think it was important," she said. "Not important?" Mrs. Henderson looked amazed. "Margaret, you are going to be famous. The whole city is talking about you." As Margaret began her work cleaning the classrooms, teachers and students kept stopping to talk to her. Everyone had seen the news story or the videos that people had posted online. Some of the videos had already been watched by thousands of people. "Mrs. Margaret," said a little girl named Sarah, "my mom says you are going to play with the big orchestra. Is that true?" Margaret smiled at the child. "Maybe," she said, "if I do well in the next part of the competition. Can you teach me to play piano?" Sarah asked. Before Margaret could answer, Sarah's teacher, Miss Johnson, came over. "Margaret, I hope you do not mind, but I told the children about your audition. They are so excited. Would you consider playing something for them during music class?" Margaret had never performed in front of children before. The idea made her nervous, but when she looked at Sarah's hopeful face, she could not say no. "I could play something simple," she said. Word spread quickly through the school. By the time Margaret finished her cleaning work, a crowd of teachers and students had gathered in the music room. The school's old piano was not very good, but it would have to do. Margaret sat down at the piano bench and looked out at all the young faces watching her. She decided to play something they would recognize, so she began with "Twinkle, Little Star." But she played it in a beautiful way, with gentle harmonies and a soft melody that made the simple song sound magical. The children listened with wide eyes. When she finished, they clapped and cheered. "More! More!" they shouted. Margaret played a few more songs, including a lullaby that made some of the younger children sleepy. When she was done, Sarah raised her hand. "Mrs. Margaret," Sarah said, "when I grow up, I want to play piano just like you." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. "Then you should practice every day," she said, "and never give up on your dreams." That afternoon, Margaret received a phone call from the competition organizers. They had found her a music coach, a famous pianist named Professor Williams, who usually only worked with students from the best music schools. "Mrs. Smith," the woman on the phone said, "Professor Williams saw your audition video and insisted on working with you. He said he has never heard such natural musicality. He wants to meet with you tomorrow to begin preparing for the semi-final round." Margaret had heard of Professor Williams. He was considered one of the best piano teachers in the country. She could not believe he wanted to work with her. The next day, Margaret took the bus to the university where Professor Williams taught. The music building was huge and fancy, with practice rooms filled with expensive pianos. Students walked through the halls carrying violins, flutes, and sheet music. Professor Williams was an older man with white hair and kind eyes. When Margaret met him, she expected him to be stern and serious like the professors she had seen in movies. Instead, he smiled warmly and shook her hand. "Mrs. Smith," he said, "I have been teaching piano for 40 years and I have never heard anything like your performance. You have a gift that comes along maybe once in a generation." Margaret did not know what to say. "Thank you, sir. Please call me James," he said. "Now let us hear you play something. I want to understand how you approach the music." Margaret sat down at the beautiful grand piano in his studio. It was even nicer than the one she had played at the audition. She decided to play Bach's Italian Concerto, a piece she had been working on for months. As she played, Professor Williams listened carefully. He did not interrupt or correct her. He just sat quietly, sometimes nodding his head or smiling. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Remarkable," he finally said. "You have developed your own style completely by yourself. Some of your fingering choices are unusual, but they work perfectly for you. You have an instinct for phrasing that I cannot teach. It must come from the heart. Is that bad?" Margaret asked. "That I learned by myself?" Professor Williams laughed. "Bad? My dear woman, it is wonderful. Most of my students spend years trying to unlearn the mechanical way they were taught and find their own musical voice. You already have yours. They work together for 2 hours." Professor Williams helped Margaret with some technical details and suggested ways to make certain passages clearer. But mostly, he encouraged her to trust her instincts. "The semi-final round will be different," he explained. "You will play with a chamber orchestra, which means working with other musicians. They will be watching you for cues, and you will need to watch the conductor." This made Margaret nervous. She had always played alone. The idea of coordinating with other people seemed very difficult. "Do not worry," Professor Williams said. "Music is a conversation. When you play with others, you listen to what they are saying and respond. It is like talking with friends." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret continued working at the school during the day and practiced with Professor Williams in the evening. She also spent hours at home on her old piano, working on the piece she would play for the semifinals, Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 2-1. The piece was longer and more complex than anything she had ever performed. There were sections where the orchestra played alone, and she had to count carefully to know when to come back in. There were also places where she played along with the orchestra, creating beautiful harmonies Professor Williams arranged for Margaret to practice with a small group of musicians from the university. At first, it was confusing. She was not used to hearing other instruments while she played. But gradually, she began to understand what Professor Williams meant about music. Being a conversation, the violin would play a melody, and she would answer with the piano. The cello would provide a deep, rich foundation that supported her playing. The flute would dance around her melody like a bird singing. It was more beautiful than playing alone, but also more challenging. As the day of the semifinals approached, Margaret began to feel nervous again. The competition would be held in the city's largest concert hall, which seated 2,000 people. There would be television cameras and reporters. The whole event would be broadcast live. Margaret had never performed in front of more than a few dozen people. The thought of 2,000 pairs of eyes watching her made her hands shake. "I do not know if I can do this," she told Professor Williams. During their last practice session, he sat down next to her on the piano bench. "Margaret," he said gently, "do you remember why you started playing piano?" She thought about it. "Because it made me happy. Because when I played, I felt like I could express things I could not say with words." "Exactly," he said. "That has not changed. Whether you are playing for one person or 2,000 people, the music is the same. Your job is not to impress the audience. Your job is to share the beauty you feel inside." Margaret nodded, but she still felt scared. "I will tell you a secret," Professor Williams said. "Every great performer feels nervous before they go on stage. The nervousness means you care about doing well. But when you sit down at the piano and put your hands on the keys, all of that will disappear. The music will take over." The night before the semifinals, Margaret could not sleep. She kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. What if she forgot the music? What if her hands shook too much to play properly? What if the other musicians did not like working with her? She got up and went to her old piano. She played, softly so she would not wake her neighbors. As her fingers moved across the familiar keys, she felt calmer. This was home. This was where she belonged. She thought about her mother, who had always believed in her. She thought about little Sarah at school, who wanted to learn piano. She thought about all the people who had dreams but were afraid to try. Tomorrow was not just about winning a competition. It was about showing that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. It was about proving that talent and hard work mattered more than money or connections. Margaret fell asleep at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys. The day of the semifinals arrived with gray clouds and light rain. Margaret woke up early and spent extra time getting ready. She had bought a new dress for the performance, a simple black one that made her feel elegant and confident. Professor Williams had arranged to meet her at the concert hall 3 hours before the performance to practice with the orchestra one final time. When Margaret arrived, she was amazed at how big the hall was. The stage seemed huge, with rows and rows of empty red seats stretching up to the ceiling. "Good morning, Margaret," said Maestro Rodriguez, the conductor who would be leading the orchestra. He was a small man with a friendly smile. "Are you ready for this?" Margaret's hands were already shaking. "I think so," she said. Though her voice sounded uncertain, the orchestra musicians were setting up their instruments and warming up. There were violins, violas, cellos, and basses for the string section. There were flutes, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons for the woodwinds. There were French horns, trumpets, trombones, and a tuba for the brass section. And at the back, there were timpani and other percussion instruments. Margaret had never seen so many musicians in one place. The sound of them all tuning their instruments at the same time was overwhelming. "Do not worry about them," Maestro Rodriguez said, noticing her nervous expression. "They are all here to support you. They want you to succeed." The rehearsal went better than Margaret had expected. The orchestra members were professional and kind. When she made small mistakes, they did not seem bothered. The concertmaster, a woman named Elena, who played first violin, gave her encouraging smiles. "You play beautifully," Elena said during a break. "I have performed this concerto many times, but I have never heard it played with such feeling." As the afternoon went on, Margaret began to feel more comfortable. The Mozart concerto sounded magnificent with the full orchestra. The music seemed to fill every corner of the huge hall. But when it came time for the actual performance, Margaret's nerves returned. The hall was filling up with people. She could see the television cameras being set up. Reporters were interviewing the other competitors backstage. There were 3 other pianists in the semifinals. All of them had studied at famous music schools. One was a young man who had already won several international competitions. Another was a woman who performed regularly with orchestras around the world. The third was a recent graduate from a prestigious conservatory. Margaret felt out of place among them. They spoke confidently about their careers and upcoming concerts. They knew the names of famous conductors and composers that Margaret had never heard of. "First time performing with an orchestra?" asked the young man who had won competitions. He did not sound mean, just curious. "Yes," Margaret admitted. "Well, do not worry too much if you make mistakes," he said. "The orchestra will keep going, and most people in the audience will not notice small errors." Margaret nodded, but his words made her more nervous rather than less. Professor Williams found her sitting alone in a corner of the backstage area. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Scared," she said honestly. "Good," he said, surprising her. "Fear means you care. Fear means this matters to you. The best performers in the world still feel scared before important concerts. What if I embarrass myself? What if I prove that I do not belong here?" Professor Williams sat down next to her. "Margaret, you have already proven that you belong here. Your audition was extraordinary. Your work these past 2 weeks has been impressive. You have earned your place on this stage." He paused and looked at her seriously. "But I want you to remember something. This competition is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that you found the courage to try. Win or lose, you have already inspired thousands of people. Margaret did not understand what he meant until he showed her his phone. Videos of her audition had been shared millions of times on social media. There were articles about her in newspapers and magazines. People were calling her the cleaning lady who amazed the judges and the woman who proved it is never too late to follow your dreams. "Look at these messages," Professor Williams said, scrolling through comments on the videos. People from all over the world had written about how her story had inspired them to pursue their own dreams. A 70-year-old man in Japan had started taking violin lessons. A single mother in Brazil had auditioned for her local choir. A teenager in Australia had decided not to give up on learning guitar. "You see," Professor Williams said, "you have already won something more valuable than any competition. You have shown people that dreams can come true." Margaret felt tears in her eyes, but this time they were not from fear. They were from gratitude and amazement that her simple decision to audition had touched so many lives. The time came for the performance to begin. Margaret was the third pianist to perform, which meant she had to wait and listen to the others play first. The young competition winner played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. His technique was perfect, every note precise and clear. The audience applauded enthusiastically when he finished. The professional performer played Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. She played with power and drama that filled the entire hall. The audience gave her a standing ovation. Now it was Margaret's turn. As she walked onto the stage, she could feel 2,000 pairs of eyes watching her. The lights were so bright she could barely see the audience, but she could hear them whispering. She sat down at the grand piano and adjusted the bench. Maestro Rodriguez looked at her and smiled reassuringly. He raised his baton, and the orchestra prepared to begin. In that moment, just before the music started, Margaret felt something change. Inside her, the fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else. Excitement, joy, a feeling that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The orchestra began the opening of Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21. The melody was gentle and beautiful, like a conversation between old friends. When it was time for Margaret to enter, she placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. Immediately, she felt at home. This was not different from playing in her small apartment, except that now she had beautiful voices joining her. The orchestra responded to her playing, and she responded to theirs. It was exactly like the conversation Professor Williams had described. Margaret forgot about the audience, the cameras, and the competition. She forgot about her fears and doubts. She was completely lost in the music, communicating through Mozart's beautiful melodies with the talented musicians around. The first movement was playful and elegant. Margaret's fingers danced across the keys, playing scales and arpeggios that sparkled like diamonds. The orchestra provided a rich foundation that made every note she played sound more beautiful. The second movement was slow and emotional. This was the most famous part of the concerto, a melody so beautiful it had been used in movies and commercials. Margaret played it with such tenderness that some people in the audience began to cry. The strings of the orchestra seemed to sing along with her, creating harmonies that filled the hall with warmth. The third movement was fast and joyful, like a celebration. Margaret's hands flew across the keyboard, playing rapid passages that required tremendous skill. But she made it look effortless, as if the music was flowing naturally from her heart to her fingers. Throughout the entire performance, Margaret felt like she was flying. She was no longer Margaret the cleaning lady, worried about what people thought of her. She was Margaret the musician, sharing something beautiful with the world. When the last note rang out, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the audience exploded into applause. People jumped to their feet, clapping and cheering. The orchestra members were smiling and nodding their approval. Even the other competitors were applauding enthusiastically. Margaret stood up from the piano bench, feeling dizzy from the emotion and excitement. She curtsied to the audience, then turned to thank the orchestra. Maestro Rodriguez shook her hand warmly. "That was magnificent," he whispered. "Absolutely magnificent." As Margaret walked off the stage, she knew that whatever happened next, this moment would stay with her forever. She had faced her fears and shared her gift with the world. She had proven to herself and others that dreams really can come true. No matter who you are or where you come from, the little girl inside her who had always loved music was finally free to sing. 3 days after her performance, Margaret still could not believe what was happening to her life. Her phone had not stopped ringing since she walked off that stage. Reporters wanted interviews. Television shows wanted her as a guest. Music teachers from around the country were offering to work with her, but the most surprising call came from Mrs. Chun, the principal of a fancy private music school across town. Margaret had cleaned that building once when their regular cleaning company was sick. She remembered how beautiful and expensive everything looked inside. "Mrs. Smith," Mrs. Chun said over the phone, "I saw your performance on television. It was absolutely breathtaking. I have a proposal for you that I think you might find interesting." Margaret was curious. What kind of proposal? "Well, we have been looking for someone to teach piano to our adult students. Many of our teachers are very good with technique, but they struggle to connect with older students who are just beginning. You have something special. You understand what it means to learn music later in life." Margaret was shocked. "But I am not a real teacher. I have never taught anyone except that one time at the school where I work." "Mrs. Smith," Mrs. Chun said gently, "being able to play beautifully and being able to teach are two different gifts. But sometimes the best teachers are those who remember what it feels like to struggle and dream. Would you consider coming in to meet with me?" Margaret agreed to visit the music school the next afternoon. When she arrived, she was amazed at how different the building looked during the day. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, making the marble floors shine. Students walked through the halls carrying their instruments, practicing scales and melodies. Mrs. Chun showed Margaret around the school. There were practice rooms with grand pianos, a concert hall with perfect acoustics, and a library filled with thousands of pieces of sheet music. Everything was beautiful and expensive, but it also felt warm and welcoming. "This is where we hold our adult classes," Mrs. Chun said, opening the door to a comfortable room with several pianos. "We have students from age 30 to 80. Some are complete beginners, others played when they were young and want to start again." Margaret looked around the room and imagined herself teaching here. It seemed impossible, but also exciting. "I would like you to meet someone," Mrs. Chun said, leading Margaret to another room. Inside, an elderly man with white hair was slowly playing a simple melody on an old upright piano. His fingers moved carefully as if he was thinking about each note. "Robert," Mrs. Chun called softly, "I would like you to meet someone." The man looked up and smiled. "Hello," he said. "Are you a new student too?" "This is Margaret Smith," Mrs. Chun said. "The woman from the piano competition." Robert's eyes widened. "You are the cleaning lady who played Mozart? I watched your performance 3 times online. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." Margaret felt embarrassed by the compliment. "Thank you. Mrs. Chun tells me you are learning piano." "Too," Robert laughed. "Learning is a strong word. I am 75 years old and just started lessons 6 months ago. My wife passed away last year, and the house was too quiet. I thought music might help fill the emptiness." Margaret understood that feeling. Music had always been her companion during lonely times. "The problem is," Robert continued, "my teacher is very young and very talented. She tries to be patient with me, but I can tell she gets frustrated when I cannot remember things or when my fingers do not move fast enough. I feel like I am wasting her time." Margaret sat down at the piano bench next to Robert. "What are you working on?" she asked. "Just this simple song," he said, showing her the sheet music. "It is called Für Elise by Beethoven. I know it is probably too difficult for a beginner, but it was my wife's favorite piece." Margaret looked at the music. "She had learned this piece years ago. Can I show you something?" she asked. Robert nodded eagerly. Margaret began to play Für Elise, but she played it very slowly and simply. She left out some of the more difficult ornaments and focused on the main melody. It still sounded beautiful, but it was much easier to understand. "You see," she said, You do not have to play every single note exactly like the composer wrote it, especially when you are learning. The most important thing is to capture the feeling of the music. She showed Robert how to play. Just the opening melody with his right hand while playing very simple chords with his left hand. Within a few minutes, he was playing a recognizable version of his wife's favorite song. "That is amazing," Robert said, his eyes filling with tears. "I have been struggling with this for months, and you made it so clear in just a few minutes." Mrs. Chun had been watching quietly from the doorway. "You see what I mean?" she said to Margaret. "You have a gift for teaching." Over the next hour, Margaret worked with two more adult students. One was a woman in her 40s who had always wanted to learn piano but never had the chance as a child. The other was a retired businessman who wanted to surprise his grandchildren. By learning to play their favorite songs with each student, Margaret found herself naturally understanding their struggles and finding ways to help them. She remembered what it felt like to be confused by sheet music or frustrated when her fingers would not do what she wanted them to do. "I do not teach the way other piano teachers teach," Margaret told Mrs. Chun as they talked afterward. "I never learned the proper methods." "That might be exactly what makes you special," Mrs. Chun replied. "You teach from the heart. You help people connect with the music emotionally before worrying about perfect technique." Margaret thought about the offer as she rode the bus home. Teaching piano would mean less time cleaning offices and schools. It would mean working with people who wanted to learn instead of just trying to stay invisible while doing her job. When she got home, she found her neighbor Mrs. Garcia waiting outside her apartment door. Mrs. Garcia was a kind woman who had lived in the building for 20 years, but they had never talked much beyond polite greetings. "Margaret," Mrs. Garcia said, "I hope you do not mind me bothering you. I saw you on the news and I wanted to tell you something." Margaret invited her inside for tea. Her small apartment looked even smaller after visiting the fancy music school, but it still felt like home. "I wanted you to know," Mrs. Garcia said, "that I have been listening to you practice piano for years. The walls in this building are thin, and I can hear you playing at night." Margaret felt embarrassed. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." "I tried to play quietly." "Disturb me," Mrs. Garcia laughed. No, you do not understand. Your music has been the soundtrack to my life for 20 years. When my husband was sick, your playing helped me feel less alone. When I could not sleep, your gentle melodies would calm my mind." Margaret was amazed. She had never known that anyone was listening. "There were nights when I would sit by the wall just to hear you play," Mrs. Garcia continued. "Your music helped me through some very difficult times. I always wondered who the mysterious pianist was." "I had no idea anyone could hear me," Margaret said. "I was not the only one," Mrs. Garcia said. "Mrs. Thompson upstairs used to tell me how much she enjoyed your evening concerts. Mr. Williams next door said your playing reminded him of his mother, who used to play piano when he was a child." Margaret realized that for years she had been sharing her music without even knowing it. Her gift had been touching people's lives in ways she never imagined. "When I saw you on television," Mrs. Garcia said, "I cried. I was so proud and happy for you, but I also wanted to thank you for all the beautiful music you have given to our little building." That night, Margaret called Mrs. Chun and accepted the teaching position. She also made another decision. She would continue living in her small apartment and playing her old piano. This was where her musical journey had begun, and this was where she wanted it to continue. The next morning, she gave notice at the school where she had been cleaning. The principal, Mrs. Henderson, was sad to see her go but excited about her new opportunity. "You will always have a home here," Mrs. Henderson said. "And I hope you will still come play for the children sometimes." Margaret promised she would. Little Helen, who had asked about piano lessons, ran up to hug her goodbye. "Mrs. Margaret," Helen said, "when I grow up, I want to be brave like you." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Margaret asked. "My mom says you were scared to audition, but you did it anyway." "That is what brave people do. They do things even when they are scared." Margaret hugged the little girl tightly. "You are absolutely right," she said. Being brave does not mean you are not scared. It means you do what you believe in, even when you are scared. As Margaret walked out of the school for the last time as a cleaning lady, she felt like she was stepping into a completely new life. But she also felt like she was finally becoming the person she had always been inside. The competition results would be announced in 1 week, but Margaret realized she had already won something much more valuable than any prize. She had found her voice, her purpose, and her place in the world.